Good afternoon, friends. Hello, hello, hello. I am John Carlson. I am the director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here today. I see a lot of new faces. We're especially glad to have first-timers here at the Center for this, our Hardt-Nickachos Peace Studies lecture featuring Tim Winter. Couple things for those of you who may not have scooched in. I think we're clearing the empty seats or taking up the empty seats, but if you've got one and you can slide over to leave more room on the end, that would be great. We also will bring in chairs more chairs if we need them. If any of you watched or heard any of the debate last night, you know that one of the primary candidates said to her competitor, every time I hear you speak, I feel a little dumber. Which I thought was just a remarkable comment. It was funny, it was surprising, but it was also very poignant and lamentable, right? And in some ways, she was speaking on behalf of many Americans and other observers of our political discourse these days. And I just want to say this is we here at the Center strive to do the exact opposite. We're reminded of how much of our political discourse and our public discourse, or what passes as such, it doesn't make us smarter, or it may actually make us dumber. And we need to be committed, and here at the Center we have been committed for the last 20 years to trying to make ourselves smarter, to stretch our minds, to challenge assumptions, to extend our imaginations. And today's event will be no exception at all. So I thank you for joining me in this charge and in this mission to enrich our lives and make ourselves smarter. A couple other housekeeping items. If you haven't already, please hit the silent button on those cell phones. There's always someone who forgets to do it. Just don't let it be you. We are being live streamed today, so hello to our digital audience out there. For those joining in person, you can stick around afterwards for a short reception, or as long as you like, actually. And I also want to just take a moment to thank the incredible staff that we have here at the Center, Matt Correa, Dawn Beeson, Alex Brooks, and Milu Cabrera, who make everything happen around here, including this event today. So thank you. I also want to share with you some upcoming events. If you've been watching the slides before the talk today, you will have seen some of them. First is going to be Tuesday, October 17th at 7 p.m. Our annual Marshall Distinguished Lecture featuring Eddie Glaude, who is a professor at Princeton, a well-known political commentator, a leading public intellectual of our time. You don't want to miss that talk. Also, save the date for Thursday, November 2nd, when we'll have journalist Sam Kestenbaum, formerly of NPR, giving a talk in West Hall on the topic of conspirituality. That'll be, again, also at 4:30, West Hall 135. That's part of our Spirituality and Public Life initiative. And 1 week later, on Thursday, November 4th, again, same time and place, 4:30, 135, we'll have the next installment of our Religion and Conflict Past and Future series, which will follow up an event that we had earlier this month featuring scholar Mark Juergensmeyer. This will feature a panel discussion among ASU faculty experts, our very own, Tracy Fessenden, Anand Gopal, Margaret Hansen, and a.k.a. all exploring and comparing what's happening in the regions of the world and cultures that they study. You can find information about all of our events on our website. You can also sign up for our newsletters and updates out there in the lobby with a little sign-up pad. And you can catch our past events, if you've missed any of them, on our YouTube channel, or follow us on social media. You know all of the platforms there. Okay. So now is that time when I come to thank everyone who is a friend of the center and who has been a strong supporter of us over the last year. And for those of you who have not or might be interested, there are myriad creative ways of becoming a friend of the center and supporting our work, whether that's through estate planning, through payroll deductions, IRA, charitable contributions. We also accept checks, credit cards, or envelopes stuffed with cash. If you have gold bars in your possession, as apparently some Americans still do, that works for us too, for any of our donors from New Jersey. Sure, just let us know. In all seriousness, though, the amount doesn't matter. What matters is investing in this community, in the civic health of this community that we all share and are part of together. And that's not just verbiage that I put out there, and I want to give you an illustration of why. Today's annual Hardt-Nickachos Lecture in Peace Studies is part of a center's long-standing endowment in their Peace Studies program, which was made possible by an endowment of one of our friends of the center, Anne Hart. She is Professor Emerita of the Mary Lou Fulton College of Education, and while she is unable to be here today, her gift of now 15 years ago still makes it possible for us to gather every year, as we're doing right now, to hear from luminaries, to invite them to guide us, to inspire us, to think about how to pursue peace in our lives, in our communities, and in our world. And what an incredible legacy that is, and we thank you, Anne Hart. I spoke with Anne earlier today to tell her about today's event, and it was great to hear her voice, and she shared with me, I quote, "I really miss being with you all." So you are here in spirit, and we are here trying to fulfill the visions of your spirit, Anne, so thank you. Our Peace Studies initiative also supports the Hardt-Nickachos Chair in Peace Studies, which is held by Professor and my colleague Yasmin Saikia. Professor Saikia's leadership and sustained efforts to deepen our understanding of peace and to hasten its reach have had a lasting impact here at ASU on students, on colleagues, the university throughout, and all of those who are touched by her work in the center and beyond and around the world. So it is with great appreciation and deep admiration that I'm now going to turn things over to her to introduce our speaker. Yasmin.
Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon. Thank you so many of you for coming here. It's lovely to see so many new faces at our center's event. And we knew that so many will be here that we decided to have the show here today rather than in room 135 in West Hall. I'm delighted. It's a lifetime kind of event for me here as a Hardt-Nickachos Peace Chair to host Dr. Tim Winter. Some of you may know him as Sheikh Hakim Murad, to spend some time and talk to us about some new work that he's doing. Of course, very few of you need an introduction to Sheikh Murad, Professor Hakim Winter, but nonetheless, I'll take this opportunity to introduce him formally again. He is the Sheikh Zayed Lecturer. It's different, like the same position that I have. It's a named professorship at Cambridge University in the School of Divinity. He is the Director of Studies of Theology at Ruth St College and is the founder of the Cambridge Muslim College. Several of you have probably become aware of this college, which is doing fabulous work, particularly with Muslim youth. Most importantly, over and above these titles, Professor Winter is deeply engaged in his own study, and he has been writing several books that are phenomenal, and several of you have probably also read them. One of his most important publications, of course, is his translation of Imam Ghazali's Ihya al-Uddin, which I think very few may not be aware of. and should be if you have not looked at it. A more recent book that many of you can probably read very easily, hopefully, is Traveling Home, Essays on Islam in Europe. It's particularly useful for youth and for people who are trying to figure out how to be Muslims in the West. I would also, several of you already know that he's so, besides being prolific, is also reaching out to a variety of audiences on YouTube. He probably has more videos than our center has in 20 years. So you can look at it and listen to it, particularly for the English-speaking community that need a lot of information, since we do not have the opportunity for those kind of discussions in our normal university campuses. Of course, besides all of that kind of thing, for me, as I said, it's a lifetime event. I have been inviting people to be my peace lecturer for the last 12 years, but this is the crowning glory, because I have never met Professor Winter before. I have listened to his videos, read his books for many years, and particularly during the COVID lockdown, he was like this friend who told me, stay put and do the work. Don't get distracted, because you must keep following this journey. For this, I was just like, it was like knowing him without ever meeting him. So when I met him today, I told him I was very intimidated. I have, never been intimidated by any other previous speakers, but I've been intimidated by his presence here because he's larger than life for many of us. And for several of you who perhaps have not pondered over this, I would almost see him as the new reviver of the 21st century for the Muslims of particularly the West. So it's with great honor, absolute pleasure, and total humility, I invite Professor Tim Winter to deliver the Hardt-Nickachos Chair in Peace today. Thank you.
Professor Saikia, Dr. Carlson, everybody at the study, the Center of the Study for Religion and Conflict, enormously grateful, honored to be with you today. I hope everybody can hear. If not, please gesticulate angrily and I'll try and turn up the volume. What I want to do today is not in some kind of conventional way to go over a refutation of the legend of East-West rivalry, although a rivalry in perhaps friendly mode would not necessarily be an undesirable thing. Nor am I going to add to the endlessly recycled chorus of denunciations of extremism. This is by now rather unnecessary. After all, the principal conflict occupying our headlines today currently does not involve Muslims, radical or otherwise, but is between two Christian nations in Eastern Europe. His All Holiness, the Patriarch of all the Russias, having declared a holy war, his words on his Ukrainian neighbors. Just as we therefore do not condemn Christianity for warmongering, so do we not condemn Islam for having its own extremists. Indeed, if we're going to tediously add together the sum total of deaths in world conflicts over the past century and a half, we find that fewer than 1% of violent deaths in that history have been caused by Muslim protagonists. It's evident to anybody who reads. Such people are likely to spit out and scorn all of those silly stereotypes. The page has been turned. Let them consider the beam in their own Western eye. In any case, the old talk of East and West doesn't really match our reality any longer. In Britain now, Islam is certainly not part of an East. It's the faith of the Mayor of London. The First Minister of Scotland forms an integral weft in our own social fabric. The first 3 National Health Service doctors to die of COVID-19 in British hospitals were all Muslims. And with the prospect of demographic rejuvenation and spiritual uplift brought by the providential gift of boat people crossing the English Channel every day, the nation seems pretty well placed to deal with declining birth rates and religious observance. the same may be said for very many crumbling, declining Western states. So today we're going to be examining aspects of this prospect of rejuvenation brought by this new and old European and American religion, looking behind the surface, or as the journalist would say, behind the veil, to the deeper structures of relation and mutual understanding, or allergy. What do we find there behind the surface? Quickly we note that this Western religion has for a long time been regarded by more thoughtful brains as possessed of a promise to repair a modern soul damaged by profane views of nature and of the body. Our modern society is afflicted with a mental health crisis, due in no small measure to our insistence on lifestyles and attitudes which are simply not normal to our species. We seem to live in a state of permanent anxiety and distraction. So Islam is now here, not out in the East. It's part of our West, bearing as one of the names of the Quranic God, As-Salam, the source of peace, or of wholeness. We could translate it either way. What should Muslim believers understand to be the exact nature of its therapeutic gift? If one of the Holy Prophet's traditional titles is Tabibullah, the physician appointed by God, how are Muslims here supposed to exercise this healing ministry among their fellow Westerners? To answer this rather significant question, I'm proposing to, perhaps surprisingly, examine a rather nuanced aspect of the gift of Islam to our Western cultures, the distinctively Islamic strategy of dealing with a dichotomy very familiar to philosophers, medics, and counselors alike, the body-soul distinction. Body and soul, both together, constitute our human selves. But what exactly is the relationship? In particular, how are we to restore what seems to have been the archaic human harmony between them, expressed in physical demonstrations of the soul and therefore of the sacred? Ever since the Upper Paleolithic, Homo sapiens has been responsive to the holy and the numinous, and this may be said to constitute a key element of what we are as a species. Hence the bold claim made by some evolutionary psychologists that atheism, or at least a religious apathy, should be understood as a mental illness. It's simply not what we were designed for. And hence, according to many, our sense of anxiety and restlessness finds no source of solace or resolution. So let's consider in ways that really will have to be aesthetic and rather imprecise, given the difficult and subjective nature of any talk about human selfhood, how the Muslim principle, as offered to some thoughtful Westerners, weighs forward in healing this modern anomie. So let's, perhaps controversially, close the theology books for a while and consult the leading dance pioneers of the 20th century as performers of the West's migration from ecclesial to secular understandings of the body and its relationship to culture. In their psycho-spiritual autobiographies, we find articulated some growing concerns with the erratic course of modernity. We may detect in the course of modern dance the outlines of a kind of sub-Islamic answer to the attempt by philosophers such as Maurice Merleau-Ponty to provide a philosophy of the body subject which recognizes the embodied mediation of all human perception and thought and the need for a body-soul synergy, the most fundamental piece of all. Dance may be considered to be not only the most ancient form of human cultural expression, but also a perennial indicant of humanity's relationship to the world. Authentic dance is no less than a way of being, permitting a dynamic synergy between ourselves and nature. It provides participants with an Einfühlung, a unitive feeling which was vital to pre-modern and hence ecologically sustainable and contextually harmonized humanity. The circular dance of the ancient Dionysians, conducted by a shaman chanting rhyming oracles, is conceived as a form encountered almost universally among primordial peoples. For this Dionysian principle, growth, eros, fertility, and death form a cycle which harmonizes us both with the earthly and with the celestial. As one author on dance puts it, in all ages and peoples, except during the interregnum of 2,000 years of Western history, dance has been rooted in all vital experiences of societies and individuals, those of love and death, wars and religions. The exceptional interregnum, ourselves, is where we need to direct our attention and concern. Now, during the Renaissance, Europe began to leave behind medieval ascetic wars on the flesh and to rediscover the more positive views of the body which were common in classical antiquity. But this seemed to achieve little more than the steady evolution of the ballet, an art which, as the same analyst puts it, degenerated into an academicism and a virtuosity with no human meaning at all. Instead of acknowledging the union of the holy and the libidinous as the primordial dances had done, the geometric, quantitative performativity of the ballet offered no philosophical lessons about the gravitational force which both separates and unites earth and sky. One might consider Rameau's Les Indes Galantes of 1735 as a symptomatic precursor of a new classicality expressed in technical and essentially meaningless gymnastics. Championing Enlightenment individualism and the romantic idolatry of woman, ballet can appear as an excruciating secular denial of the body's logic. Feet standing en pointe would bleed with the pain. Women had to be gamine, thin, small. It seemed to be a sub-Augustinian continuation of the war of body and spirit, performed, as its final apotheosis in St. Petersburg demonstrated, to powdered aristocratic elites, attentive only to technique and display. Here is Sergei Diaghilev, 1872 to 1929. He saw himself as a warrior against this artificiality when he created his Ballet Russe as the vehicle for a modern agenda of bodily retrieval. Following his example, modern dance began as an avant-garde space for the exploration of the West's post-asceticism and its quest for non-dichotomizing replacements. Perhaps the birth of the modern style further synchronized with the quantum revolution in physics, as well as with sub-nationalist experiments with the repristination of national myths in which shamans and warriors were exemplary. Some attempted this ressourcement by looking to classical antiquity. Isadora Duncan, 1877 to 1927, amazed by paintings like Botticelli's Primavera and recoiling from her strict Presbyterian upbringing, studied the poses of the Dionysiac revelers portrayed on ancient ceramics conserved in the Louvre, looking for spontaneous reflections of human appurtenance to what she perceived as a celebratory and vernal natural order. Unwilling, nonetheless, to let go of the Christ principle, she traveled to Athens to attempt a Christianized version of this biophiliac ritual, using Byzantine chants in place of the old Attic choirs. But her barefoot spiritual motions still seemed to collide with the old Augustinian dualism, body against spirit. So she wrote, "My soul was a battlefield where Apollo, Dionysus, Christ, Nietzsche, and Richard Wagner disputed the ground." A battle like that could never really be won. But after Duncan, the conclusion that the purpose of classical ballet is to separate the movements of the body from those of the soul seemed even more irrefutable. When we consider Martha Graham, 1894 to 1991, we seem to discern really the watershed where this titanic struggle between nature and spirit as principles of dance was finally resolved. But this was tragically not in favor of a monotheism of fitra, or of nature, as Islam would express matters, but of the fractal and undirected randomness which physicists such as Heisenberg seem to be perceiving in the foundation of nature. A true natural dance must now be jerky, non-sequential, restless, representing human agitation in a godless universe. After her, people like Doris Humphrey and Merce Cunningham contemplated the closure of the 20th century's reaction to the old asceticism with the arrival of truly contemporary dance, random, non-representational, free of memory, and highly interactive with technology. For Cunningham in particular, the synchrony of music and dance must be finally broken if dance is to be free of the past and of everything else. As with so many discourses of modernity, the assumption is that true human freedom must include a freedom from all inherited stories. This closure is really not terribly startling. After all, the same journey was being traced by music, John Cage's stochastic orchestration, the narrative-free vibrations of Stockhausen, and by painting. If you think of the trajectory from Giotto to Lucien Freud by Bouguereau and Courbet. The quest for a Western and hence Abrahamic body subject which can perceive transcendence in human amplitude seemed now to collapse into the Foucaultian mania for intensity in a world where senselessness made perfect and conclusive sense, in which the ancient human desire for transcendence was replaced by an endlessly interesting vertigo experienced by sophisticated novelties, danced at the edge of the void left by a receding Christianity. A dimension of the earlier stages of this arc, which some critics have neglected, is a recurrent fondness for Oriental motifs, rhythms, dress designs, and stories. Diaghilev's explorations of primordial dimensions of his Russian national dance were not confined to Slavic shamanistic epics, although he's best remembered for his choreography of the Rites of Spring and the Firebird. Particularly in his earlier years with productions such as Scheherazade, Salome, and Le Peri, he and his costume designer Leon Bakst had explored the color-rich Eastern and specifically Islamicate elements of Russian culture, which Europhile nationalists had tended to underplay. The indigenes of deep Russia, he believed, were always, quote, thinking with the European half of their brains and dreaming with the Oriental half. This appears to have been the dimension of the Ballet Russ's repertoire which was most agreeable with the spiritual leanings of another key figure, perhaps the most important of all, the American dance pioneer Ruth St. Denis, 1880 to 1968. Incidentally, the University of Arizona holds a really valuable photographic archive of her work. In the 1920s, she is said to have been the most photographed woman in the world. Reacting again against her strict chapel background, which imposed a terrible weight upon my spirit, she saw herself as a spiritual illuminator. I wish to say through my body that man in all his arts and spiritual perception must be worshipping the Godhead, whatever name he may be called, Jehovah, Brahma, Allah. The body's geometric forms are the very patterns and designs of divinity. Although she adored the Dionysian Duncan, who gave us new standards of bodily normality, St. Denis saw the Grecian style as an extroverted energy, quite unlike Oriental introversion. Thus she became convinced that the revalidation of the body, and hence the retrieval of a spiritual subject, was best accomplished by the emulation of Eastern models. Although the feminine mode of this, she thought, would be Indian and the masculine would be Arab, this binary could be challenged by recurrent Orientalist ideas of the veiled, sinuous Venus Pudica, as in her Algerian sequence, the Dance of the Aisawa. She used such translations as she could find of Saadi, Rumi, and Hafez to enact her psychic identification with the Orient, while her husband, Ted Shawn, who had traveled to Spain to learn dancing, ventured into still warmer lands to find a fuller and more spiritually infleshed dance amongst the Sufis of Biskra in Algeria and in Tunisia. When performing in London, she visited the docks to seek out Lascars, recruiting one, a certain Mohul Khan, to be her assistant and advisor on her travels in America. St. Denis evolved a simple but consistent theology of contemporary dance, which she saw as a space for contesting dull, modern mercantilism. All the arts of our Western world, she wrote, have more or less gone their own way on purely aesthetic principles, quite unconcerned with religion or morals, and this is particularly true of the stage. Blending what she understood of Christian Science, anti-Trinitarianism, Advaita, Theosophy, and Islamic dance traditions, St. Denis sometimes tried, as Duncan had done, to include Augustinian religion in her grand project for the stage's re-spiritualization. Yet to her, the figure of Christ always appeared as a stumbling block. Was the incarnate God truly a man, she wondered, or some kind of Gnostic phantom? For her generation, the rehabilitation of eros had become really important. And yet she wondered, did Jesus the man ever know passion or desire? We've seemingly never had the courage to ask. So she tried to follow an apostolic Christianity before Paul had cast it into a theology, or John, as she said, had cast it into a philosophy. She longed for a true gospel vision of a nature-man harmony. As she worked in the Islamic-style villa, which she'd built towards the end of her life in the Bronx, still there, I think, St. Denis appears never to have worked out the relationship between the sensual, oriental spirituality she admired and the unmistakably Ebionite Christianity to which she found herself drawn. Others, however, made the same connection more successfully. One example was somebody called Hilda Buick, the 1908 graduate of the Royal Academy of Dance in London, who became the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts in London, who became the first English ballerina in Diaghilev's troupe. She danced in many of the Ballet Russ's early Oriental productions and also in Frederick Lawrence's Valse Arabesque. Leaving Diaghilev's troupe after an argument with Pavlova, she married an Iranian and came to Islam, becoming a respected philanthropist in Tehran. Recent researchers disclosed the relationship which existed between Diaghilev's circle and a better-known dancer, the avant-garde French poetess and Rodin model, Valentine de Saint-Point, 1875 to 1953. She shared Diaghilev's distaste for the inhuman angularity of the ballet with what she saw as its mutilating athleticism, and also inveighed against ecclesial body-mind dualisms which she believed had inflicted a damaging rendering on the human spirit. Ever since making a youthful visit to the Friday Mosque of Cordoba, she had experienced a steady gravitation towards Islam. She said, "My soul agonized in the passional churches and was raised up in the pure intellectuality of mosques." But she differed with Diaghilev, Baxter, Duncan in her rejection of any dependence on ancient Greece and its stylized gestures. Her distinctive style of dance, to which she gave the name la métachorie, was soon plagiarized by Cocteau for use in Diaghilev's first modern ballet, which was heavily shaped by Cubism and Futurism, taking it in a direction which was very profane and which she hadn't intended. This is a modern reproduction of her metachoric dances. Exploring masculine and feminine polarities and their dyadic and androgynous resolution in the Divine One, the movements of her dance sought to enact the sacred grandeur of the human condition, love and war, cyclical and linear time, origin and return. They recall nothing of the possessed agitation of the rites of spring, or the human dressage of the old ballet, or of Duncan's Phil-Hellenic nostalgia. The German patron of Ruth St. Denis could only describe Saint-Point's metachoric enactments as Gothic, in that they recognized an inhabited geometry of earthly transcendence. We might incidentally add that we know now that the Gothic idiom, of course, owes its ultimate inspiration to the Islamic. Gothic architecture is nothing to do with the Goths, it's from the Saracens. The dance was performed first in Paris in 1913 and later at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York in 1917 with St. Denis amongst the enraptured spectators. This was still some years before Saint-Point's formal conversion to Islam. Described by Martin Lings as clearly an attempt to fill a gaping void in the art of the West, that is, of the Christian West, the metachoric rite pointed not to self-vaunting, but to the experience of transcendence through ego denial. It was performed wearing a face veil, while nonetheless entirely affirming the body and its divinely appointed functions. Again, a subtly Islamic concept of the venos pudica is in play, the veiling which signifies a modest but entire relaxation into the body's needs. A few modern dancers, as here, have attempted to continue or revive the metachoric form of sacred dance, but none, as far as I know, has continued to research the Islamic or the Islamic resonances. Although it's, I think, quite unlikely that Islamic traditions of sacred dance ever directly influenced Saint-Point's work, There are evident convergences in the understanding of libido, modesty, and the Dionysian exhilaration of pre-modern Muslim mystical cultures. Resembling La Métagorie in certain ways is the geometrically structured but sensual choreography of the more recent Swiss dancer Maurice Béjart, 1927 to 2007. Béjart adopted aspects of the classical ballet while considering it as a whole to be a degradation of dance. Although he'd studied for a while under Martha Graham, like St. Denis, he attempted to re-signify dance as an instrument as well as an articulation of a timely abolition of the damaging body-soul dichotomy. Through dance, he said, I try to make an offering of serenity and unity to Western man, who is so atomized, fragmented, and compartmentalized. For Béjart, the old Augustinian binary had only been exacerbated by the dissolution of modern subjectivity. But where the physicalist philosopher Merleau-Ponty sought to resolve this by affirming the ineluctable embodiedness of thought, offering no therapeutic technique, Béjart attempted to heal us through a comprehensive return to the spirit and to a denial of the very existence of the profane in a divine universe of immanence and integration. He had converted following an encounter with the Iranian mystic and musician Nur Ali Ilahi, 1895 to 1974, and found inspiration in the mystic Ibn Arabi's cosmology of dynamic flux and radical presence. As with Saint-Point, Béjart sought to use dance to represent eros as a permeable membrane between body and spirit. One rather amusing result was a denial of permission to perform beyond the Iron Curtain. An official told him, "Your work is either about sex or God, and in the Soviet Union we have no need of either." Islam's Tawheed seemed to resolve this unitive principle pretty perfectly. To my mind, Islam answers that yearning for unicity, union, and simplicity. Islam is a religion which is thoroughly integrated with the cosmos, a religion where every daily act is marked by a belief in indivision, where the practice of the sacred is daily and constant. One final illustration, I want to consider the pathway of another Swiss pioneer, Christine Brodbeck. She was born in Bâle in 1950 and had also trained as a professional dancer. Disillusioned, like Béjart, with what she called the narrowness of classical ballet, she evolved and taught her own idiom of natural dance, as she called it. Converting to Islam after observing rituals and hearing Quranic recitation in a New York mosque, she moved to Istanbul, she still lives there, where she connected with traditional sacred dance practitioners and began to teach her style of dance. She also became an author of quite popular devotional manuals, translated into many languages. In her writings, she explained Islam as the religion of love and of wonderment, and as the natural terminus of her disenchantment with capitalist modernity and its linear and disintegrated culture. Europe is pregnant with Islam, she believes, acknowledging that Islam had been waiting to heal her, watching her struggles and her progress, for the water looks for the thirsty. I did not convert, she writes, I simply discovered the hidden treasures inside of me. Islam gifted her with heart wakefulness, a body subject in Merleau-Ponty's sense, but one whose integration allowed a new and frankly mystical epistemology. How precious is our body, she effuses, if we understand that our body is God's treasure house, that our body is a divine instrument, how careful we should be in its use. The miraculous activities of our bodies are chaos making thousands of changes in 1 second. We have to oppose those heavy transactions with the divine substance of light. That is why, in the religion of Islam, the body is most involved in completing sacred duties. Educating the body is nothing else than making matter subtle, making what is heavy, light, and striving towards cleanliness, innocence, and purity. On the other side, the soul has to be translated into the body. Sainthood manifests itself exclusively on the earthly plane. Although Brodbeck's writings lay no claim to systematic theological status, taken as a whole, they contain quite a comprehensive ontology of the body subject, which seems entirely suffused with Ibn Arabi's cosmology and anthropology, which had already, as we've seen, inspired Béjart. Like Saint-Point, who had campaigned for Egyptian independence during her retirement in Cairo, Brodbeck is aware of the deeper origins of an Occidental Islamophobia which rejected this solution. She writes this: "In the subconsciousness of the power-hungry global invaders, the infinity of the eternal light of Islam has become their most hated object. Islam's decisive solution to the perennial Western crisis of embodied mind is fearfully repudiated by a civilization which kicks against the pricks and which refuses to acknowledge God's gift of joyfully integrated body-subject." While these Muslim heirs to Diaghilev are pretty diverse, certain themes do appear to be recurrent. Pondering their interesting biographies, we attempt to sketch ways in which contemporary dance has stood at the forefront of the post-ascetic recovery of the libidinal. On occasion, this was framed as a return to the primitive and the shamanic, but more commonly it moved geographically as well and insisted on the counter-Enlightenment trope of Oriental wisdom. In a certain way, the much criticized Orientalist typecasting actually bore fruit. The old Christian reproach of a Saracenic world devoted to the worship of Venus and an eroticized paradise could be inverted to become a wistful envy of a sensual world in which the body and its functions were granted a valued place. The paradox of a crusading Christendom, which had condemned Islam for its martial virtues, was hardly less significant a theme, so that Europe's Muslim aliens were both Venusians and Martians. Now both styles of otherness were belatedly given a new meaning and implicitly forgiven. This movement in dance was evidently a kind of epiphenomenon of the wider Byronic drift to an almost chiliastic end-time Eastern resolution of Europe's agony. This drift appeared not only in Byron's Childe Harold, but very abundantly in the final paradisal imagery of Goethe's Westostlicher Divan and the decisive last page of Joyce's Ulysses, where Nora's yes to the south, in a Gibraltar which elides the Spaniard, the Moor, and eros, offers a resolution of Stephen Daedalus's sense that history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. It suggests a countercultural liberation of gender also, through a rehabilitation of the generative principle. All the figures we have considered were viscerally hostile to feminism, which, as Camille Paglia, the feminist, claims, has failed to take into account women's intricate connection with nature. The 20th century recovery of the body subject in explicitly pagan Dionysian mode, expressed notably by assorted German Lebensreform movements, seemed unable to compete with this Oriental imperative. Even the Lebensreform pioneer Karl Wilhelm Diefenbach, disappointed in the malfunctioning utopian Bavarian commune which he had founded, attempted to travel east before death cut his plans short. Such tendencies eventually migrated to California, birthplace of all new things, where they were de-Hellenized and absorbed into Indic and Sufi narratives by the likes of Sam Lewis, Ahmed Chishti, 1896 to 1971. There he is, Sufi Sam. Lewis injected these ideas of a liberated spiritual embodiment into mainstream New Age culture in the form of his Dances of Universal Peace, inspired originally by Ruth St. Denis, which brought a simplified redaction of Islamic sacred dance to a very wide non-Muslim public. The dances became almost a signature tune for New Age religion. The movements of the Gurdjieff sect, allegedly also deduced from Sufi liturgies and usually performed to 12 semitone arabesque melodies, have also proved quite durable, although their highly regimented affectivity seemed to make of them a type of almost militarized flamenco, which was poorly suited to later 20th century sensibilities and needs. Yet the more ecstatic New Age appropriations continue to manifest Western man's struggle in wearing his body sacredly, as any observer of self-avowed transformational or psytrance bacchanalia such as Burning Man, the Boom Festival or Ozora will readily admit. The ambition of St. Denis, Saint-Point, Béja and the rest for a Dionysian rite in which Western humanity could recover a natural spirituality remains, frankly, unfulfilled. The psychedelic drugs have largely taken the place which the revolutionary pioneers had found for God. The result seems to be a directionless danse macabre. Looking at the early 20th century's mystical modernities, which dissolved into the rave culture following the quick failure of the Haight-Ashbury experiment, we would observe that St. Denis's sense of a divinely oscillating universe was always liable to collapse into a fractal and random view of reality. It lacked the monotheist sense of God's custom, which made the world probabilistically but still decisively and indicatively ordered. Without the God of Abraham, bodily liberation somehow soon seemed to tend towards chaos. Our narrative thus suggests that modern dance strove for the quantum but collapsed into the random. Without the presence of symbolism or any faculty of transsensory perception, the Dionysian energic cosmos affirmed by Islamic theology and mysticism, described by American Muslim theologian Henry Bayman as the condensation of the absolute, remained forever beyond the Occidental grasp. The opportunity for rediscovering the sacred seemed to be lost. Moreover, the individualistic and self-loving spirit of the age never really came to terms with the universal axiom of all traditional religion. As God said to the Sufi Bayazid, "Abandon yourself and come to me." Scientific materialism has reiterated the philosopher Schopenhauer's belief in instinct as a delusion, which tricks humanity with false meanings into obedience to the blind duty of reproduction. The libidinal body subject can thus only be the vehicle and victim of a survival-oriented ruse contrived by the selfish gene. The philosopher Lyotard intensifies this with his postmodern rejection of the fantasy of a non-alienated religion. There is no road home. Despite the fall of Augustinian dualism, late modernity has ensured that the Western body maintains its dynamic and often lamented dissociation from nature and transcendence. From an Islamic, non-alienated perspective, this resurgence of dualism is the symptom not of a broader range of agonistic paradoxes which the Ishmaelite dispensation is sent down to resolve. Islam thus understands its claim to reparative purpose to extend beyond the doctrinal to the anthropological. So at this point, let's take stock, having offered these contentions, change direction a bit. I've tried to reflect on the manner in which the Dionysian quality of Islam has proved convergent with many of the anti-secular turns in 20th century Western dance, and how it seems to have declined into often indulgent forms of self-affirmation and self-love. At this point, one could take a charming and picturesque detour to describe and reflect upon specific forms of sacred dance in the Islamic world. Here we have Andalusian exile Muslims singing to accompany the Hadra dance in northern Morocco. The Hadra, the circular rhythm dance with its markedly primordial character, seems to be practiced really throughout the world wherever there are Muslims. The Mevlevi turning, however, the so-called whirling dervishes, remains the best known in the West, but there are also innumerable forms prevalent in orders such as the Khalwati and the Chishti, very widespread in the old Ottoman and Mughal territories and further east in Indonesia. We could also analyze the various formal Sharia verdicts on these sacred dances, which often take their cue from the prophetic response to a group of Abyssinians who danced in his mosque. But we can't really spend time here on the halal-haram discussions which remain ongoing, other than to note that contemporary forms of Islam, finding comfort in a withered Puritanism and a type of shame culture, are often hostile to these classical forms in ways which the pre-modern scholars might have found unnecessary and even concerning. As so often, religious choices can be quite clearly understood in psychological terms. For too many believers nowadays, faith is a matter of defending one's identity and picking fights. Contemporary Puritan forms of Islam, reacting angrily and anxiously against Western violence and hedonism, are often attributed to mid-20th century reformers such as Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian founder, some would say, of the more radical wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. Academic studies of the more radical forms of modern Islam often like to begin with Qutb's sojourn during the late 1940s in the American Southwest, specifically at the Colorado State College for Education. In this little 1949 essay, The America That I Have Seen, Qutb lambasted America as racist, pornographic, and materialistic, warning Egyptians against the seductive dangers of westernization. His reaction to the America of those times became the first manifesto of the more acutely rejectionist, dichotomizing tendency very often visible in modern Islamism. But let's pass over the dismal details to consider a rather different Muslim response to America. For all his xenophobia, Qutb was a very modernized kind of Egyptian who'd been influenced by the crypto-fascist French writer Alexis Carrel. For him, America could only be an enemy, an antitype of the good. There is nothing in him of the Islamic style which so entranced the likes of Ruth St. Denis. But that style had nonetheless reached America, thanks to various subtle channels of inspiration and osmosis. We mentioned that a Californian pupil, Sufi Sam, Ahmed Chishti, had created a version of Islamic dance for Americans, the dances of universal peace. In these rituals, Arabic and other formulas, some from the Quran, are recited rhythmically by usually middle-class and middle-aged Americans as they circle each other in patterns derived rather loosely from the Hadra and other Muslim traditions of sacred dance. These continue to thrive. There are regular gatherings here in Phoenix, for instance. Of course, the practitioners, as they chant from the Quran and the Hadith, do not see themselves usually as Muslims. They tend to be universalists in various senses. And the American Muslim theologian Charles Upton calls universal Sufis cut flowers in a vase. For him, they are bereft of the sanad, the initiatic prophetic connection which will connect them fully to the ocean of Muhammadan light. And yet, as the sign of a discreet American thirst for Islamic forms, they may certainly transmit a certain grace. In any case, they facilitated the arrival in New York in the late 1970s of a Muslim very different from Sayyid Qutb. This was Sheikh Muzaffar Ozak, a Turkish teacher of the Jarahi order. His impact in New York was sensational and has been excellently recorded in a recent book, Lifting the Boundaries, by one of his American disciples, Gregory Blann, also known as Muhammad Jamal. He recalls the holiness of his teacher in this quote. The New York Times and various other media were frankly awestruck by the ceremonies he led in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, the ground having been prepared by somebody called Salik Schwartz, who for years had led the Dances of Universal Peace in the same building. After a formal Quranic recitation, the ceremony began, as Blann records, and they came, swelling the circle from a few dozen into hundreds, circles around circles, arms joined, young and old Muslims, Christians, Jews in colourful yarmulkas, Buddhists, Hindus, people in Eastern robes and Western dress, united in one great pulsating, turning mass of humanity, together chanting the divine names, unveiling the light of the divine countenance. On another occasion, the same Khalwati sacred ritual was broadcast live from the studio of WBAI. Interviewed live, Sheikh Muzaffar was asked to repeat the La ilaha illallah clearly so the audience could follow and gain its blessings. Afterwards, he said this, I couldn't hold back my tears and began to weep. How could I have done otherwise? Millions of Americans were listening over the radio, expecting to hear our repetition of divine unity. I started repeating La ilaha illallah and was fervently joined by my dervishes. At that point, I felt as though the skies of America were echoing with Tawheed and the entire creation was listening to our affirmation of divine unity. The Sheikh then prayed, and the Americans prayed with him. Unite us in love and eliminate our anger and animosity. Transform our animosity into love and kindness. You are the only one who can do this. This American receptivity to the message of an entirely traditional Muslim sheikh recalls some of the great historic ages of Muslim growth. Evidently, Sheikh Muzaffar's positive view of the Americans he met was an element. Sayyid Qutb and his Islamist descendants would have died rather than repeat Muzaffar's words, "I pray that the name of America will be written in gold for the pages of history." But here we see the capacity of classical Islam to pass through the door prized open by the Dances of Universal Peace, which in turn had been a spark from the philo-Muslim embodied spirituality of Ruth St. Denis and Ted Shawn. Thus did Ishmaelite religion retrieve its ancient calling of healing and uniting. The old Islam, rather than the new Islam of Qutb, still commands the loyalty of most Muslims around the world and in the West. It's supported by no government and has no transnational organizations. It is orphaned everywhere, and yet still it predominates. Despised by many Westerners simply because it's Muslim, and by the Qutbians because it respects the principle of love and ecstasy, it is embattled. Yet I'd like to go on to suggest that its survival and regrowth are vital if humanity is to outlive the current crises caused by rampant modernity. Qutbian Islam simply adds to humanity's travails. One recalls the words of the poet R.S. Thomas denouncing fundamentalism. The adroit castrator of art, the bitter negation of song and dance and the heart's innocent joy, you have botched our flesh and left us only the soul's terrible impotence in a warm world. If the dancers whose voices we have listened to have something to offer us, what might it be? Could it help us to retrace our steps to that older Islam which once filled a New York cathedral with lovers intoxicated by the sound of the Quran? Perhaps the key lies in the concept of the primordial, which we've already referred to several times. The human being and the physical brain which sits in it is designed for life in the Stone Age. That was a time, presumably, of forms of animism, in which the whole cosmos was felt to be alive. Idolatry came later, perhaps in the Neolithic. But in the very, very ancient times, there was what Durkheim called the principle of mana, a life force present variably in places and people. To experience mana is to see the world as a continuum of the holy, the human, and the natural. Hence, for our ancestors of 100,000 years ago, the principle of life and fertility seems to have been central, and it was this embodied sense of subjectivity which energized the ancient, often circular dances in which stories were sung, and the human unity with the sacred and the natural was represented. This Durkheimian picture of how things were in unimaginable to ancient times may not be quite accurate. Still, it's evident that our modern dancers, particularly St. Denis and Béjar, found the modern dichotomy between body and spirit to be a key trigger of contemporary disquiet and psychic and societal dysfunction. Nietzsche articulated this in his book, The Birth of Tragedy, in which he understood human fullness to emerge from the due balance of what he called the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Our machine age has damaged our embodied lives by suffocating the Dionysian. We feel the lack of a primordial, forested, swaying circle of chanted oracles. Oppressed by the cold, linear dichotomies of Apollo, we need to resurrect Dionysus. In the context of Islamic religion, there are likely to be as many forms of this as there are styles of regional dress and food, since the body subject's more effective articulations will inevitably be culture-specific. However, it's evident that the 5 times daily Muslim prayer, the namaz, will remain the unshakable foundation of Islam's insistence on devotion articulated with rather than against the body. Again, Charles Upton summarizes its function rather well. In namaz, we balance al-jalal and al-jamal through the medium of the human body and unite them. We make a ritual synthesis between the names of beauty and the names of majesty, and in so doing become the locus of manifestation of the name Allah, thus fulfilling the human mandate. That, of course, is Malcolm X in the great mosque in the Citadel in Cairo. So the namaz is thus, in Upton's understanding, the most perfect embodiment of the Islamic quest to harmonize body and soul, beauty and majesty, to re-establish the Adamic possibility to which the angels are commanded to prostrate in the Quran. The namaz is mandatory. It's not a dance, evidently, and one recalls that dance is only physiologically possible for certain people, while ritual is meant for everyone. Hence, dance certainly cannot be a religious obligation. And yet Béjar claims that dance can be an offering of serenity and unity to Western man, suffering, anxious, and alienated from the life principle. For him, it can assist in the restoration of a primordial soul-body unity, as self-knowledge and self-repair are only possible through a harmonious inhabiting of one's physical form. Moreover, it affirms the aestheticism of religion. As Kazuya Murata writes, the Holy Prophet was the most passionate lover of beauty, and he taught that three things increase the power of sight: gazing at green plants, gazing at beautiful faces, and gazing at flowing water. Through a recovery of the primordial, or as Islam would say, fitri, body subject, we can use our senses soundly once more. And dance and religion begin together in the archaic human sense of the wonder of the natural world and the human place in it. The balanced body subject sees clearly and cannot help but perceive the metaphysical in the physical. The imbalanced, scrolling on their phones and cycling past nature in lycra and goggles, cannot do so. Ecstasy is impossible for them. As Nietzsche said, those who hear not the music think the dancers mad. For Muslims, the ultimate exemplar here will be the sage himself, the prophet of the Fitra, who heard the voices of the animals, rocks, and mountains. It was he who brought the namaz from his ascension in Jerusalem and the divine presence itself, where all the divine names of majesty and beauty originate and return. Martin Lings describes him thus: a perfect man made in his image to be one of his messengers, and as such, at the level of primordial man, the microcosmic equivalent of the great outer world of virgin nature, the world of plains, forests, hills, mountains, springs, rivers, and lakes, the macrocosm of earth. This is the heart of Islam, the man of praise, Muhammad, who entirely inhabits the world of affect and intensity. A worshipper, healer, reconciler, a heroic martial defender of his people, a lover, he shows us the full possibility of the human form of life, the Lebensform, through his way, the Sunnah. Embodying sanctity, barakah, seeing and hearing it everywhere, he restores his people to a primordial path. The book he bears is filled with nature and its wonders, from the moon to the womb. We are returned to an archaic sense of the unity which is the source and ground of non-human and human difference. This is evidently Dionysian religion, reinstituted by heaven to enable complex late cultures to reconnect with the primordial and therefore the normal. So the contemporary, and particularly the 20th century meta-nostalgia for the ancient, nature-affirming and even pagan sacred, which allowed Duncan, St. Denis and many others to be liberated from the rigidities of the ballet tradition, found partial satisfaction in the sensuous affirmation of the body's form and motions present in Islamic cultures. They seem to have intuited that a direct return to the ancient pagan ways which we've lost would be both impossible and dangerous. We need hardly mention the dismal consequences of many politicized paganisms. Mussolini and Hitler were only two of the worst misinterpreters of the pagan and primordial worlds. During their time, the French Muslim writer René Guénon was already noting the irretrievable decadence of residual paganism in his book The Reign of Quantity. Charles Upton also observes that primordialism cannot be a viable form in itself. The nourishing fruit grows on the branches of the tree, not the trunk. Isadora Duncan tried to sway along with the maidens dancing on Grecian vases, but this was inevitably an anachronism detached from whatever initiatic rites and beliefs once supported pagan Greek understandings of the body. In Spain, nationalists and nativists today sometimes look to flamenco as a living recollection of a sensual and natural age before the arrival of flagellant priests and Inquisition friars. Yet, as Spanish philosopher Blas Infante has pointed out, the flamenco of the dispossessed Gitano people of Andalusia is in reality a lament for the lost intensities of the Moorish Dionysus. It is a music of the eternal return, refusing mechanical structure and following the affect of the moment. It feels oppressed by the Western keys which constantly seek to alter it, struggling painfully in A minor and D minor and the Phrygian mode. Its agonistic quality is only superficially a lament for the lost delights of Al-Andalus. More profoundly, it is the sound of the Dionysian retreat before statist religion and the miserable impoverishment of matter imposed by modern science. Andalusian nationalists seeking to replicate other European ideologies of ancient or even racial authenticity by restoring an old paganism cannot do this in Spain, where the crusade of the Hidalgo against the sinuous, sensual, atavistic and holistic Moorish episode in the land's history has buried not an ancient utopia, but the Ishmaelite Dionysian affirmation of nature, the libido and the world, which the Moors enjoyed. So it becomes clear, rather importantly, that classical Islam's emphasis on unity through a retrieval and revindication of the Paleolithic allows a clear distinction from the Apollonian order and coercive monoculture of which Qutb's Islamists dream. Muslims seeking success on every level should remember the brightness of Sheikh Muzaffar's da'wah moment and recoil from the stark and demonizing binaries of Qutb. Today's Muslim world is quiescent as it contemplates this battle, and also as it contemplates a world in which the major failure of peace is that of Putin's war in Ukraine. But peace nowadays entails, as our attempt to respect the primordial perhaps shows, peace not only with other humans, but with the other orders of nature. The real threat our species faces is not Muslim or Christian intransigence, but the human crusade against nature. It is the consequence of modernity, not of tradition. Further, the imminence of the AI revolution suggests that not only are our own tools destroying our world, but that they might destroy its human makers as well. Peace in our strange post-normative times is challenged by new enemies, all of them of our own making. The public is still not quite deafened by the arguments of Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, who identify religion as a source of conflict and danger. Many realize that the major threat to humanity today seems to come not from religion, but from the science and technology which the new atheists are pointing to as our salvation. Yet the world, which the Quran celebrates as the trigger for the heart to dance, is still there. The ecstatic Dionysian swaying prompted by its beautiful unlikeliness is not unavailable. God's temple of joy is open and is as wide and inclusive as ever. But are we ready, or are we too busy with our entertainments, our puritanisms, or our handheld devices? Let's close with the words of the Persian poet Nizami in his Mahsan al-Asrar. The minstrels are seated on the carpet, but there is none to dance. The sea is full of pearls, but there is no diver. Thank you very much.
Thank you. What a profound talk for us to really reflect on and think about how we create unity in our own self in this kind of crazy world of believing everything what everybody tells us without going back to our own self and to the world that is around us. I open the floor for questions. I will not stand here. You will come up, each one of you, whoever wants to ask a question. You can come to the mic on the right or the left. Keep your comments and your questions as short as possible, because we would like as many people to get involved in this conversation. Anything that you want to ask, you can. This is your opportunity to have a conversation with Professor Winter. So please give everybody a chance who wants to ask a question. And if you're making a comment, please keep it very short. Thank you. So please, whoever feels like being bold enough to ask the first question, please come forward. And I can step up so that you can field the questions, or you want me to?
feel them perhaps.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for a very, very insightful presentation. I'm sorry I missed the first part of your presentation because this ballroom was pretty hard to find on this campus. But the question I had was that there is a strong element of spirituality in the ecstasy of dance, especially amongst Muslim dervishes, etc. Is there also an element of self-hypnosis in the whole ecstasy question?
I think that's rather an interesting question. And the tradition evidently, and Islam does value a certain sobriety, is how the tradition provides mechanisms to prevent the expression of extreme joy and the ecstasy of the experience of divine closeness from spilling over into something that's uncontrolled. And the answer always with these traditional practitioners is that the Sharia is not to be violated, and that the practices stop when it is time for prayer, and that the preferable mode of religious experience is through private experience, outwardly invisible, of the divine beauty. So Al-Junayd, who's considered as one of the founders of the Sufi tradition in Islam, was once at a gathering of Sufis which was very ecstatic. People were standing up and expressing their joy at the presence of the divine beloved. He was just sitting there. And he was asked, "O Master, do you not feel any of this ecstasy?" And he replied with the Quranic verse, وَتَرَى الْجِبَالَ تَحْسَبُهَا جَامِدَةً وَهِيَ تَمُرُّ مَرَّ السَّحَابِ. You see the great mountains, you think that they are fixed, but they pass away as do the clouds. So from the classical Sufi perspective, the ideal state is to experience the inward dance and the ecstasy of the contemplation of the divine beauty without it manifesting itself externally. But nonetheless, for the great majority of practitioners, and certainly for beginners, they do encourage it as a natural, as I say, primordial exposition of how the body naturally responds to the ecstasy of the experience of the divine. Self-hypnosis, various forms of self-delusion are always possible, but that's also possible in any religious practice, wherever it becomes intense, not specifically just in sacred dance. It's an
Thank you
interesting
very
part
much.
to read. Thank you. Who's next?
Take the next question.
Assalamu alaikum. So I just wanted to focus a little bit on the AI element of what you were talking about towards the end. And I was just thinking in my understanding of how AI is being incorporated into the world of art, more kind of poetry, screenwriting, music composition, I'm wondering what that might look like in the context of dance and perhaps fana or some of the movements that we were seeing or you were describing by some of the dancers before. What might the involvement of AI look like in that, or is it a case of robotics and robots dancing?
I don't think that anybody has the least understanding of what AI will be doing to us even 2 years from now. The consequences for every aspect of our humanity, the economy, consciousness are likely to be profound and transformational. However, I think most of these theorists, and particularly the dancers themselves, would want to make the point that we are at our most fully human when body and spirit are properly interactive and engaged, and we become a single human body subject. And to the extent that our creativity or even aspects of thought are farmed out to bodiless forms of cognition, that integration becomes impossible. So I think that would be the main bearing of AI on the point that these people are making. But as I said, we're on the brink of the unknowable, and of course a very terrifying unknowable, given the negative outcomes that some people are predicting. But yeah, I could actually have spent more time talking about the consequence of the human migration into the cyber world for the further degradation of the proper integration of human beings into their own bodies. It's very difficult to be bodily engaged with something that's online, and that really can't be good for us. Maybe it has something to do with the current epidemic, pandemic even, of mental, cognitive, dissociative disorders, anxiety issues, the depression pandemic. There's a deep unease that I think can only be accelerated by the fact that our minds are somewhere on the web and our bodies are idling. It's not how we're designed to be.
Sheikh Abdal Hakim, we thank you for your enlightening comments. What's interesting is that as you took us through this journey of trying to understand a balance of body and soul, you went down the means of art to do so. And to your point in some of the comments you had made, that for people of faith, you had referenced Muslims in this case, that there's a kind of a Puritan trend that might seek to strip art from a means of recognizing, in this case, the balance between body and soul. And so how do you encourage people of faith, whether it be Muslim or otherwise, to use written art, visual art, physical art, as the subject of today, as a means of understanding and appreciating how faith can manifest itself and how we can better appreciate other ways of understanding balance between body and soul?
Well, in a specifically Muslim context, and each tradition is going to have its own way of doing this. So in the rabbinical Jewish tradition, for instance, the rabbi is always dancing on the feast days. It's very much an embodied celebratory tradition. Hindu traditions often have rich traditions of sacred dance and so forth, not specifically Islamic. In the Muslim situation, one would wish to begin with a proper intention and personal cognitive integration into the embodied practices which are mandatory in the religion. The 5 daily prayers, which don't just integrate the brain and the soul into the movements of the body, but also integrate the body-soul unity into the movements of the cosmos. So we know when the sun goes down and when the sun rises because we're getting up and praying. It's a very primordial thing. Sun and moon are amongst the earliest divine signs recognized by primordial peoples, and the Muslim insistence, the whole structure of the Muslim day is still determined by the movements of the planet beneath our feet, and that the sacred calendar is determined by the moon and the phases of the moon. It's another indication of this din al-fitra, primordiality. And I think that has to be a very healthy thing for us. The same with techniques of pilgrimage, the same with the fast. So that has to be the foundation of it. Other more evolved traditions of sacred dance, most notably the Hadra art at the discretion of individual tariqas, and even in those tariqas it may be that some individuals are recommended not to participate in those practices. But I think across the board in world religions you find people trying to explore ways of reintegrating body and spirit, which have become dangerously dichotomized, which the religions really should try to bring together again, but sometimes don't. Some of the wrong forms of asceticism, some of the wrong attitudes to human sexuality and so forth, and purity laws can sometimes exacerbate the body-soul dichotomy, so that in some parts of the Muslim world today you find a very strong shame culture about the body, for instance, which is simply not there in the Islamic texts, but is certainly palpable in some Muslim cultures. So yeah, Muslims as well have a lot of work to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a question that we come to.
Do you want to go ahead?
No, that's okay, go ahead.
So could you comment to this idea of technology as a source, not of progress, but of damnation. Like, so not salvation, but damnation, which is kind of maybe a short way of saying one of the ideas you seem to be suggesting. Why is that so not obvious?
Because everybody, including myself, loves our cars and our handheld gadgets, and we like to see robots scraping dust from rocks in the asteroid belt, and it's very exciting, and it has an entertainment value and makes our lives more comfortable. I personally would not wish to go back to the Upper Paleolithic to have my root canal work done. It brings certain very practical advantages. The problem seems to be, and this was anticipated 100 years ago now by the French Muslim writer René Guénon in his book, The Reign of Quantity, that modernity every year makes us a little bit more comfortable, but it also multiplies the existential risks. Maybe climate change will kill us. Maybe AI will kill us. Nanotechnology, genetic manipulation, every year seems to bring a new existential risk. So the modern world is basically a great gamble. We're much more comfortable. I wouldn't want to go back even to 100 years ago in terms of medical care and other things that we have available, forms of transport. But there's also an added risk, and that's part of the culture of anxiety that we have in the modern world, particularly amongst young people. The future is kind of cloudy. Sort of the negative Terminator possibilities are there in a lot of science fiction movies, which are a good way of seeing what the culture responds to in terms of its sense of where technology is taking us. The Matrix, the Terminator, most of those films portray a profoundly dystopian future. And that's why we need to turn back to these ancient wisdoms, frankly. It's not the Apaches who've destroyed the ecosystem. Maybe they knew how to live in this land in a way that could have lasted for millions of years, and we need to sit at their feet and see how they did it without joining them or replicating their forms, because you can't really join those tribal forms of religion. But in the monotheisms and other world religions, I expect, in certain forms, there are ways of recovering some aspect of the primordial oneness with nature, with transcendence, with the body, which is really what we're designed for, but which enable us nonetheless to function in the context of a complex modern world.
Could you say, so that reconciliation that you're describing, like what does that look like?
It's about peace in this sense, the peace within, without which there's not going to be any peace in the world. Peace between religions, yes, peace between civilizations, but unless there's a deep sakina, tranquility, rooted in a direct awareness of the nature of the divine, it's not going to happen. One thing that you find if you read the sacred texts of the world religions, and particularly those great saints who believe that the veil has been lifted and that they've seen reality, al-haq, even though they come from so many different traditions, but every single one of them has said, what I found there was perfect beauty, perfect light, perfect compassion. Everybody, from the Hindu sages to Meister Eckhart to Ibn Arabi, what is beyond is perfect goodness and love and compassion. Once you know that that's the ground of being, and you have peace within yourself because you know everything ultimately is made of God's compassion, then you can, with good reason, rather than just pragmatically, deal with your fellow man and with other civilizations. Yeah.
So can I just ask, so does that mean you have to give up the technology and the convenience in order to see that? Or how do you...
No, I mean, I didn't take a sailing ship to come here, I'm afraid. We're all compromised one way or another. Yeah.
Thank you.
But we need to have this awareness, and sometimes the scientists in their tunnel vision excitedness don't quite get it, that there needs to be something to put a brake on the more dangerous implications of what they're doing. Genetic mastery is a very scary thing when you consider the implications of it. AI, all of them potentially terrifying. And if that wisdom and that insistence that we are not just made to be comfortable doesn't come from the world religions, where is it going to come from? It's not going to come from the Democratic Party or from the Republican Party or the Conservative Party in the UK. They have their own internal logic, but they don't think big in a way that would enable them really to provide the moral brake and guidance on this helter-skelter runaway world of technological breakthroughs that we're now facing. It has to come from the world's sacred traditions. Yeah, and hopefully this is a way of bringing them together.
One question.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for coming here. I had more of a comment. I remember watching your YouTube video about the gift of death and God's decree. And I remember clearly you saying, Al-mawtu tuhfatul mu'min.
Yep.
Death is the crown jewel of the believer. And that put me on a journey to seek this peace, because we all believe as Muslims that we are on a journey that will end with us passing
Yep.
away. And I just wanted to thank you for setting me on that journey.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else has a question, comment? Yes, please.
Thank you for the presentation. It was fantastic. You recounted a number of attempts by various dancers to more or less, mostly less successfully, to reclaim some element of the Dionysian through art. Do you feel that there is any way to incorporate the Urf of the West or the secular capitalism, the New World, however you quantify it, to find within the Urf some authentic manner of that dance, or does it need the sanad, like you mentioned, going back to the more traditional tariqa?
Yeah, that's a very good question again. It's based on a distinction that Islamic religion makes between that which is known to be part of the religion, like the 5 daily prayers in Ramadan, and is explicit in the Muslim scriptures, and that which represents an inculturation in local cultures, like wearing Indian dress or having a minaret of a particular shape, things which are pretty important in terms of people's sense of identity. And for those living in the West, what does that Urf, or that local customary precedent, look like? Well, it depends where you are. I would say, if you're here, it has to be a reverent exploration and affirmation of at least many aspects of the traditions of the native populations, the indigenous pre-white settlement populations, the Apache, the Hopi, the Navajo, whoever. And that if you're looking for decorative features for your mosque, and you don't just want a Turkish mosque, which makes a rather problematic statement about Islam's belongingness if your identity is just from overseas, then you should look to the decorative motifs of the native peoples of the Americas, and particularly the Southwest. And I'd recommend a book by a Native American theologian called Vine Deloria, called God is Red, which is a very interesting and pretty rigorous exploration of what he takes to be the general unifying features of the Native American worldview, and its attitude to nature, and its attitude to the Great Spirit, and its attitude to family. And there's so much there that's Islamic. And I think that since those people have been the victims of ethnic cleansing and a great wrong, and there hasn't really been a kind of reckoning, that Muslims, and hopefully others as well, should lead the way in trying to affirm their life ways, but not uncritically, and to explore an Urf, an enculturated form of religion that is inspired by some of their motifs and maybe some of their practices as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. We will close the formal questions and comment sessions now, but you're welcome. There's a reception, so please take the moment to enjoy the food here, but most importantly, I would like to thank Professor Winter, and I want to thank all of you for being such wonderful kind of, audience, and allowing and taking the time to listen and be part of a new family of the Center of the Study of Religion and Conflict. Thank you so much, Professor Winter, for coming to us and for being here for such a long time, and for looking forward to tomorrow's session with you again. Thank you so much, and be here.